What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the SQL video series on how to use SQL Aggregate Functions. In this video tutorial, I'm going to talk about count. Count as an aggregate function in SQL. Let's talk about aggregation in general terms. Aggregation is considered a collection of objects that are bound together. Or to simply put, aggregation is a task of pretty much aggregating or collecting a set of values and then returning a single value based off of that. So, for example, if we have a column of data, which is a collection of of heights, and then if we collect a set of values, if we collect the average of these heights, right? Or if we perform an average function on everyone's height, and then we return a single value, in which case would be the average of all of those heights, then we are doing an aggregate function. So in a database product, you may want to calculate the aggregate functions using SQL queries, right? And each of the aggregate functions are applied differently, given the requirement, the context, and also the tool that you're using. So the pgadmin 4 is pretty friendly with aggregate functions. I'm going to start with by bringing all of the data from our world indicator table, our very popular table that I've been using since the beginning of the tutorial for the sequels. And as I said earlier, an aggregate function is, or an aggregation is when you collect, aggregation itself is when you collect some sort of value from a list of values. So if we have all of the GDPs listed here from, for all these records, and if we want to get an aggregated value of this, for example, a sum of this, then we perform a sum, or like a sum of all of these numbers, and that number that we get is an aggregate function or an aggregate result of of some of those values. So when we perform a sum function, or when we count something, or when we do a statistical calculation of something, average, standard deviation, we are technically performing an aggregate, if it makes sense. So let's start with the account, since the purpose of this video is to demonstrate the count function. So the syntax is pretty easy. You use the select statement, and then use the count, and then if there are two ways actually you can get the count of your records or rows, uh, and one of the way is to use the asterisks, which tells SQL to give you everything that's available. And then what I mean by everything is all of the rows. So, and what it really means here, the asterisk sign here, is that any record, any row that has a value in it that was opened. So you know how sometimes we have a table, right? And then we only have one value in the entire row of the table, and so that itself is actually a record. Although it's incomplete, there are no values within that specific line or record or row. It's still considered a valid record. Why? Because it was opened, and it's not an empty cell. It's actually a record that was registered in the table. So when you use the asterisk, remember that it's going to return all of the records, regardless if there are null values in there or not, if there's only like one value. As long as there's one value and there's a record open for that specific record, then that record will also be counted towards the aggregate count. So, and then next one is we're going to direct it to the table that we would like it to perform the count function on, and then simply run it. And the result is we're getting one single value, as I said earlier. We're performing an aggregate function, or a function on a collection of values, but then as a result we're getting a single value, which is the count here. So it's telling us there are 232 count of rows or count of records within that world indicator table that we're looking at. And so in a way, this, as I said earlier, is giving us an aggregate calculation of the table, which in this case is a count of those of that table. Now let's talk about using without the count, actually using the column name, right? So before I do that, let me bring the table back because I want to show you these null values these columns where I have null values, and the GDP column has a couple of null values. The gender ratio has a couple of null values, and date independence has a couple of null values. So what I'm going to do now here is, as I said earlier, I'm going to test it now that what we're going to get as a result of. Matter of fact, let me clone this statement onto a new one, and this time instead of using the asterisk, I'm actually going to use a name of a column, which will be in this case will be the GDP. First of all, let me run the asterisk again. Remember, GDP has two null values. So remember, whatever we get for all of the table, that will be minus the two null values. So let's go ahead and run for all of the table using the asterisk. Again, it's going to give us everything where there has been a record open, registered. Doesn't matter if there are null values within any of these fields or not, as long as there was a value entered in there. So let's go ahead and run it, and 232. So remember this number, 232. Now we're going to run the same aggregate count function on GDP now on a specific column, not on everything, not on all the rows, not on the asterisk. This time we're specifying the column name, and we're going to run it. So remember 232, and we run it, bingo. So it changed to 230. What does that tell you? It tells you that when you perform a count with with a specified column, then the null values the null values will not be counted. But if you do it with an asterisk, then the null values will be counted. And I already explained the logic behind that. So as always, I can never finish a tutorial without adding the where clause. And these are so phenomenal in understanding SQL. So I'm gonna go ahead and punch in now a new statement where I'll introduce a where clause. So let's say we want to look at everything, right? But this time we want to add a where clause and say, well, give us a count of everything, but remember that give us the condition, but make sure that you take into account the condition that the region should be, let's say, my favorite part of the world, Caribbean. So let's go ahead and run this. And you're going to see now we have, or maybe I spelled Caribbean wrong. It's sad that it's my favorite part of the world, but I can't even spell it well. Well, it should tell you a lot. That means I've never been there. So go ahead and run it. There you go. So it's 24. That means the count of all of the records, all of the rows where the region column has the value of the Caribbean is actually 24. So the reason I wanted to use a where clause was to show you that actually it's not simply running an aggregate count function and then getting a result at one number, but you can actually also add multiple additional uh, you know uh, conditionalities to it, to further uh, you know uh, uh, elaborate on what you really want. So at this time, let's go ahead and create another where clause, but this time we're going to make it a little bit more complicated. And this time we're going to say, give me a count of all of the data where the conditional clause, we're going to add the conditional clause and say where the GDP, right? GDP is above, let's say, 60, and run this. You're going to see there are 95 countries where the GDP is about 60. And you can also, additionally, you can also, instead of having count, you can also create a new alias to it. So remember, you can also use the as a keyword to create an alias. So instead of saying count big integer, well, the big integer is a data type, but instead of having count, you can just say, average of all countries uh, greater. Oh, that will be a long one. So average uh, GDP. That's it. And so run it, and you're going to see that this name, the alias, the label of that aggregate column now changed to average GDP. And let's say sometimes you don't want to look at the, especially with the when you do column based, or when you do specific column based GDP count, I'm sorry, specific column based count, then you can use distinct, you can introduce distinct command here, which tells tells SQL to only give you the distinct count of those records. And for more information about distinct and unique values, take a look at one of my video tutorials where I explain this in further details. But here I'm going to just run one more and last statement where I will look at the distinct GDP count of records within the work indicator table. So remember, I'm going to run this to just know it's 230 countries where we do the count based off of GDP. Now let's say if we want to say we want to actually look at the distinct values, meaning don't count the duplicates. Any unique or distinct value should be here as well. So depending on what's again, whatever depending on the management tool IDE that you're using to talk to your database, and also your database system, the syntax is or could differ slightly, but not so much. It just needs some tweaking to be able to find the right one. But for Postgres pgadmin, when you do count distinct, make sure that you open a parentheses between count and distinct, and then so once you open one parenthesis for distinct, give me a count of distinct GDP. So if you open a parenthesis for distinct and there's another parenthesis open for GDP and close for GDP, then you make sure you add another parenthesis to close for the distinct, and then go ahead and run it. And you're going to see, remember this number 230, this will change to a number that will be below that, since we're actually getting a distinct set of value, or this we're performing an aggregate count on distinct set of values of GDP. And there you go, it's 48. So there are 48 distinct values within our work indicator table. So again, this video will be part of a playlist that will cover basics of basic and also important aspects of SQL aggregate functions. And the next video, I'm going to cover a different type of aggregate function. And if you like this video, please go ahead, like and subscribe my channel. As always, thank you so much. Until next time, have a great day.